Hi everyone. How'd you like my crappy graphic tonight? I had to rough it up myself. I'm afraid I did a very bad job. Anyway, it won't be troubling you anymore because here I am in person. I haven't had much chance to share, so you could do that for me. I would very much appreciate it. Hi Dolores, how are you? Hi Steve Gonzo, Terry Burke. My presence is present. Hi all. Hi Kay. Glad to see you. Dr. Joe, what exactly is a votorama? That is a new term for me. Okay, when you put through a reconciliation bill, there's a procedure. And the procedure involves a period where people do have a chance to amend the reconciliation bill on the floor. And when they do that, the filibuster rules are suspended, evidently, for that time for those amendments, and they require only 51 votes to pass. And what usually happens is a huge number, of votes. There are a huge number of amendments that is submitted, and then votes are taken on each one, in turn. And they might process like 250 amendments in a 6-hour period or something like that. Obviously, they have no time to read the amendments or properly consider the amendments. And terrible amendments can sometimes slip through. And once a terrible amendment comes through the votorama, and is accepted in the bill, then it becomes a part of the reconciliation bill, and it's stuck in that bill. I think it can still be eliminated in the conference bill if the amended bill is different from the House bill, which of course it would be. In the general case, it's still possible for the conference committee to delete, a terrible amendment. But once it's voted in the votorama, it would be part of the final vote on that particular bill. There is an amendment that probably will come up. It's similar to an amendment which was submitted by Mitt Romney in the first round of setting up the reconciliation framework. When the reconciliation bill, was only a resolution, there was a votorama then in the Senate. And one of the things that was voted on was a version of the Trust Act that Mitt Romney has been trying to push for some time. The way the Trust Act actually works, hi Lana, is that it sort of deals with the procedure. It's like a fiscal cliff type of thing. The reconciliation bills are supposed to be neutral over 10 years, but deficit neutral over 10 years. Basically, the Trust Act is something put in to enforce the neutrality over 10 years. The problem with the Trust Act is that it provides for cuts after the 10 years if a bill actually fails to attain the neutrality that was claimed for it. So then there's a penalty of some kind that sets in. There have to be kind of across the board cuts to various parts of the federal budget to create a deficit neutral situation. That's what it's about. Now, there were things like that in previous times. But what's different about the Trust Act is that it opens up possible cuts to entitlement programs, the Social Security and Medicare, puts them on the chopping block, okay, along with discretionary bills. So that was a very dangerous amendment in the resolution. Fortunately, it was only a part, okay, of the resolution. But if Romney submits it again as part, okay, of the vote-a-rama, it might pass because in the resolution, Democrats didn't know what they were doing about that. And that particular proposal got some 71 votes with a lot of Democrats joining the Republicans to vote for it. So the vote-a-rama can be a dangerous thing. Now, when Bernie says he's going to put an amendment on the floor, what he probably was referring to was the vote-a-rama, that he will use the vote-a-rama to try to put back into the bill the House measure that dealt with the living wage, raising the living wage to $15 an hour. So that's the vehicle he's going to use to put that on the floor, I believe. Now, I talked to you yesterday about my thought that, well, this bill came from the House and it had the minimum wage in it. And there was no indication at that point that the minimum wage provision had been cut out of the bill yet. And it hadn't been. That was taken care of this afternoon. Somehow Schumer had the right to introduce an amended version, a Senate version of the reconciliation bill. And so he did that. He was the one who put in the requested changes by the administration and by other people. Now, there were a number of these. The most important of them was tighten the eligibility criteria for the stimulus bill so that 17 million people would not get their stimulus checks, 5 million children, and 12 million adults, which amounts to really potentially 12 million voters, okay, who would not get their stimulus checks. So that was one change. And the other major change was getting rid of the mini wage provision. So Schumer had his people actually write the amendment bill. He served as the administration's vehicle for getting that in after the administration decided to try to conciliate with Joe Manchin, okay, and Kyrsten Sinema in order to get them to vote for the reconciliation bill. So that's what was going on there. I hope I answered the vote-a-rama question. The vote-a-rama is probably now going to take place on Friday, and maybe they're going to work through the night on the vote-a-rama to try to get that over with so that they can complete the bill in the Senate this weekend. It was originally supposed to take place definitely tomorrow, but Ron Johnson, the Wisconsin senator, who's become a total Trumpist, really just a total collaborator with Trump, said that he was going to delay the bill by requesting that it be read out loud. It's a 630-page bill, so it was going to take hours and hours and hours to read. I watched a part of that process go on, and after a while, I thought, this is just going to take. I'm not going to watch this for 6 to 8 or 10 hours or however long this is going to take. I was following along with the House version of the bill, and noticing the changes they put in. And there were really quite a few changes, but most of them are minor changes. The important ones are the ones that I told you about. But it was really something. He made the clerks in the House actually read this bill. So there it was. Okay. So let's get to sharing some articles here, because there's lots of stuff to share. The first one is not on Beyond Stimulus. It's from David Sirota, and it is on, title of it is How to Stop the Manchin Presidency. You can see the title now. And raise the minimum wage. And it was just posted by Dave Sirota. Well, when I picked it up, it was posted 2 hours ago. Evidently. I think that Jimmy Dore noticed it also, because he mentioned it in a video he did a few hours back. But it's a very good piece by David. He says, for the last week, Americans paying attention to politics have learned an important truth. Joe Biden may live in the White House, but conservative Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat of West Virginia, is effectively president. I think that's going a little far, but he's obviously pushing Biden around at this point. This depressing reality can certainly be fixed, but only if progressive Democrats in Congress are willing to actually change the dynamic. And they have a rare opportunity to do that right now by using their power to raise the minimum wage. But so far, they aren't choosing to use their power, which is a huge structural problem, not just now, but also for the foreseeable future. Some have argued that the way to fix this situation is by ending the filibuster. But that's a catch-22. It's absolutely a necessary reform, but President Manchin is pledging to veto it. Even if Democrats were to eliminate the filibuster, they would still need Manchin's stamp of approval for virtually all legislation, given the Senate's current 50-50 split. Yes, that is, they would have to cope with Manchin on virtually all legislation given the current 50-50 split. However, it is not true that it's completely a catch-22. And the reason why is, if you were to somehow coerce Manchin into voting with other Democrats to get rid of the filibuster, and you were successful at that, and at some point you're going to have to be successful at that, or nothing important is going to pass, as I argued last night, and the night before that too. But once the filibuster goes, then Manchin can be pressured on bill after bill after bill, if those bills are for the people, if they are in the interest of the people. Then with each passing bill that Manchin votes against, he becomes more and more vulnerable to ads in his state, to pressure on him, and to other candidates that may try to primary him, because he'll be taking blow after blow from public opinion. I don't care who you are, you can only stand against that so long if you're continuously opposing popular measures in your own party, because you're going to lose constant support from people who vote for your own party. And if the other party has a Trumpist that's going to run against you, which is going to happen, okay, in West Virginia, Manchin won't be getting any Trumpist votes. He'll only be losing Democratic votes. And that's a losing proposition. And he does have to run in 2024. So it is vital to get him to come around on the filibuster vote. So I don't think that's a catch-22. But for now, there's no question of taking up the filibuster vote when you have a reconciliation vote, which is on the table. The issue now is, how do you get the reconciliation bill? And if you have an opportunity to get the reconciliation bill through with the minimum wage provision in it, you got to take that opportunity. You really must. Going on with the Post, the way to fix this dynamic is for a decisive number of House Democrats or Democratic senators to make clear, line in the sand demands, and demonstrate that they will vote down the reconciliation bill if it does not honor those demands. And they must do this specifically on must-pass by legislation for which Biden can find 0 GOP votes. This is the way to force Biden to stop pretending he has no agency and instead motivate him to use the overwhelming power of the executive branch to press the conservative wing of the party to back down. It is also the way to get Manchin himself to negotiate. Right now, he gets to operate with impunity because there is no counterforce. Dave is completely right about that. The need for a counterforce, okay, is obvious, but how can the progressives constitute a counterforce? And why is he only talking about the progressives in the House? That's the question. Let me point out that there are progressives in the Senate. There is one gentleman by the name of Bernie Sanders who can put his foot down. I know he's not the kind of person who usually puts his foot down, but maybe he's got to put his foot down. And if he does, he can get a few other senators to come along with him. He can get Ed Markey to come along with him. He can get Jeff Merkley to come along with him. He might be able to get Sherry Brown to come along with him on the minimum wage. That bill is very important to Mr. Union Sherrod Brown. Very important. He might be able to get Ron Wyden to come along with him. There might be as many as 5 senators come along with him. Now, 5 senators in the Senate is a large group of senators. It's roughly equivalent to 20 representatives in the House, because the House has more than 4 times the number of people the Senate does. So this is significant. It's also 5 of the Democratic senators. So maybe it's time for Bernie Sanders to say, I'm not voting for this reconciliation bill unless the minimum wage is put back in it. I'm not caving to Joe Manchin. Joe Biden might cave to Joe Manchin. Kamala Harris might cave to Joe Manchin. But me and my bros here are not caving to Joe Manchin. A basic value of this party is the minimum wage, and we're not compromising on this particular basic value. A rise in the minimum wage is long overdue, and this bill is not getting out of the Senate without the minimum wage amendment being restored to the bill. I don't care what the Parliament says. the parliamentarian says, it isn't up to the parliamentarian. The parliamentarian is an advisor. I am a senator. I do not think this violates the provisions of the reconciliation bill, and backing me is the finding of CBO that it has a material impact on the budget, which is the requirement for reconciliation for provisions to be included. I am in the right here. This is a basic value of the Democratic Party, and I am not letting Joe Manchin back us down. That's it. End of story. And I'll tell you something else. If this bill fails, if this reconciliation bill fails, I'm going to introduce this on the floor. And when I do that, I'm going to raise a point of order and force a vote on the filibuster right then and there. That's what I think Bernie should do. Apart from that, though, there's a way around with the House as well. Anyway, going on with the article, Dave points out that the debate over the legislation also gives the public a way to see whether self-identified progressive heroes are as serious about actually using power as President Manchin is. And there's every reason for a stand on this, because this is, as Dave Sirota says, the crucial cause of delivering a desperately needed higher minimum wage to millions of Americans. He talks more about the bill, about its being a microcosm of the Manchin effect on things. He tells us that Manchin has successfully pressured the executive branch to support further limiting eligibility for survival checks, devising a phase-out policy so absurdly punitive that even reliably partisan Democratic pundits and centrist think tank wonks can't support it. He points out that the payments would now go to 17 million fewer people. He points out that Manchin is making austerity demands that position him to the right of his own state's Republican governor. He points out that Biden's White House is signaling that it's ignoring pleas from civil rights leaders and not supporting VP Harris to use her power as the presiding officer to advance a $15 minimum wage, even though there's ample precedent for her to do so. The reason Manchin has become the legislative center of gravity is obvious if unstated. The implicit threat is that if he doesn't get exactly what he wants, he will cast a decisive vote against the final bill, killing it in one fell swoop, because there will almost certainly be zero by Republican votes for final passage, no matter what is in the legislation. Joe Manchin, in other words, seems to have all the power and is more than happy to wield it. By contrast, Biden, the most powerful man on the planet, who just killed people in Syria by bombing them, appears to be refusing to wield power. He doesn't seem to have lifted a finger to try to change the Senate dynamic. He hasn't even pushed Manchin on minimum wage at all, which Dave says is either cartoonishly lazy, or he believes such an effort would prove fruitless, or actually doesn't want to deliver on his promises and has found the perfect excuse in the West Virginia senator. Frankly, it is probably some combination of all of these things. Well, the White House insists it's going to continue fighting for a $15 minimum wage in the future, but the reality is that if nothing changes right now, then the likelihood of a significant minimum wage increase in the next few years is incredibly slim. Any standalone substantial minimum wage bill will face a filibuster and require 60 votes to overcome it. Despite the White House fantasizing that the Republicans might support a serious minimum wage increase, there probably are not 10 GOP Senate votes to break such a filibuster. And he goes on explaining some more reasons why it's not very likely or not possible. Then he points out the key: must pass bills that the GOP will not vote for. And he points out Manchin's threat of voting down Democratic legislation is only able to disproportionately determine policy outcomes because there is not a serious ideological threat on the other side serving as a counterweight. Put another way, he's this powerful because he's willing to wield power and his purported ideological opponents are not. He remains unchecked even though there are enough progressives in Congress to create this necessary countervailing power. In an narrowly divided House in which no Republicans will vote for a relief bill, it would only take somewhere between 6 and 10 Democratic congresspeople to join together as a bloc and make a game-changing declaration that they will not vote for final passage of a Senate-passed COVID relief bill that does not include a minimum wage increase. And now we're getting into possible House opposition. Yes, it would take only 6 Democrats in the House, most probably, to block a bill. Just 6 Democrats. Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, Jamal Bowman, Cori Bush. There's your 6. Mondaire Jones, Marie Newman, Ro Khanna, Jayapal, Jamie Raskin. Lots and lots of Democratic congresspeople really want a rise in the minimum wage. Even Jan Schakowsky and Debbie Dingell and Rosa DeLauro. You get pretty deep in the caucus in terms of people who really want a rise in the minimum wage. They should be able to mobilize 25 to 30 people for that with no problem. Similarly, in the Senate, I forgot to mention Elizabeth Warren, probably because she's such a caver. But anyway, similarly in the Senate, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren or Ed Markey could pull their own version of Manchin and make the same declaration, saying they would not vote yet on final passage unless the legislation includes Sanders' amendment to increase the minimum wage. And then Dave says, such declarations would trigger a political earthquake, tectonically shifting the power structure and the assumptions built into legislative debates. Suddenly, the Manchin would not be the political solar system's sun, whose gravity forces everyone to revolve around him. He would be one of 2 poles, forcing the Biden administration to try to find compromise between them and pressuring Manchin to move. Suddenly, the Biden White House, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and Majority Leader Chuck Schumer would have to carefully weigh how much to give up to Manchin for fear of losing the other block of lawmakers on the other side of him. And they would have to do that knowing they would not be able to triangulate, simply ignore the progressives and replace them with some GOP votes. Suddenly, House progressives' demand for Harris to ignore the parliamentarian and advance the minimum wage won't just be rhetoric. With the real threat of the progressives voting down a minimum wageless COVID bill and finally passage, ignoring the parliamentarian would become crucial for Biden himself. So, what do we have to say about this? Force the vote. This is force the vote. We all know Jimmy is back wanting to force the vote. Bree Joy is back wanting to force the vote. And this time, they're right. The vote on getting the minimum wage bill back into the reconciliation bill should be forced. Because this is not only about just passing the minimum wage bill, it's about power in the Congress. It's about the importance of the progressive bloc not being dominated by Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. Basically, two loners who aren't that popular in the overall caucus either. Just people who want to present themselves as somewhat independent in their home states, where actually they would do better if they operated as conventional Democrats in favor of popular policies that have majority of support of the people in their states. People in Arizona want the $15 an hour minimum wage. Polling in West Virginia shows Manchin's constituency is for it. 63% of it. Why is he going against 63% of his voters? I know you're going to say his donors, his donors, his donors. But with 63% of his voters, it's also because he's a fool. When you got that many of your voters in back of doing what you don't want to do, if you care about your own survival, you don't make enemies of 63% of them. That is not good politics. It's terrible policy, of course, but it's also not good politics. Finally, Dave says, at the table rather than on the menu. Dave says, but whether from the film Back to the Future or from the experience of the last 4 years of Donald Trump, we've learned over and over again the only way to defeat bullies is to stand up to them. Congressional progressives must be willing to be as strong, clear, and unwavering as Manchin is villainous. They must be willing to follow through on a promise to not just cast votes against a bill Biden wants, but cast decisive votes when there are no Republicans for Biden to peel off. Votes that actually take down the legislation unless progressives' eminently reasonable demands are met. Yes, the COVID bill must pass. It includes desperately needed help for Americans who are struggling. And yes, progressives who actually take a stand will be falsely accused of killing the legislation and trampling their own honorable principles of harm reduction that typically leads them to support inadequate bills because it includes some good stuff. And I have no doubt for even writing this essay, the Daily Pollster will be instantly and falsely accused of not caring about the plight of people struggling through the economic crisis, even though we've spent 6 months holding Democrats accountable to their promise of immediate aid. But those arguments don't fly here. If, as they assert, the progressive lawmakers were predicating their votes for the relief bill on an eminently reasonable demand, like a long overdue, much promised raise of the country's starvation wage, then the legislation's momentary delay would be the fault of the party and president that refuses to deliver on that promise. It is not the fault of the party's rank and file progressive lawmakers who themselves were elected on the same minimum wage promise and who are simply taking legitimate, reasonable steps to make sure they deliver on the pledge right now. I couldn't agree with this more. I mean, you've got to go along with what you promised your constituents. And you've got to go back to them and explain why you voted this way. And you have to tell them, you know that some people would suffer immediate pain. And you're very sorry about that. But having a $15 an hour minimum wage, that has overriding importance. More than doubling the minimum wage for them, that more than compensates for most of the hardship that they would have to go through. The truth is that Manchin and Sinema and other people playing along with them are holding the constituents of the progressives hostage. That's what they're doing. And the hostage taking has to be stopped. The way to actually make that wage increase happen is to follow through and make clear no bill will pass until it is included. Otherwise, progressive votes weren't actually predicated on the $15 minimum wage at all. This isn't rocket science, it's game theory 101. This is the ancient idea of countervailing power, says David, and he's quite right. Such opportunities do not come around very often. It is incredibly rare for there to be truly must-pass legislation that no Republicans are willing to sell their vote for. Congressional progressives must be willing to use such an opportunity to make a threat and follow through, knowing that even if they momentarily delay legislation like the COVID relief bill, their party's leaders will be instantly forced back to the negotiating table to revise it. At that point, the progressives would finally be at that table rather than on the menu, which would at last provide a chance to materially improve the millions of Americans' lives. I can't agree with him more. I think this is a wonderful column. I think his advice is the right advice. I think it's force the vote. It's force the vote when it comes to the minimum wage amendment that Bernie is introducing. And if that fails in the Senate, then remember this, everybody. The two versions, the House and the Senate bills, have to be reconciled through conference committee and a conference report. And the progressives then have to go to Nancy Pelosi and they have to say, if these measures are taken out of this bill in the conference report, we will vote against the final bill and it will not pass the House. This is where we make our stand. You cannot move us. The mainstream media cannot blacken our names on this. You will not be able to persuade us to go any other way. You're going to have to include these in this bill. Our advice to you is you select us for the conference committee, and we will make sure that the final reconciliation bill that goes back to the Senate for a further vote has the minimum wage in it. And we will make Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema go on the line. That's what the progressives have to say to Nancy Pelosi. Put us on the conference committee and we will take care of it. Fill it with us. And we will see to it that there is a bill passed that can get through us. That is what they must do. Moving now, beyond the stimulus, or beyond the relief bill more properly. Let's go to Dave Dayen's problem. It's the night of the Daves again, which it often is around here, because the Daves are pretty sensible. Dave Dayen says, whatever happened to executive action? I can see he's already getting tired of the reconciliation process. And of course, he was the one who pointed out for months, he and the American Prospect. The news broke while I was writing yesterday's edition that the Senate was changing the eligibility rules for directing payments in the American Rescue Plan. Okay, the dirty details are here. Everyone making up to $75,000, $150,000 still gets the full $1,400 check. Instead of phasing out fully by $100,000/$200,000, it phases out by $80,000/$160,000. And he points out, of course, this is bad policy and bad politics. And he cites some people who think so, and I've given you some other people who thought so. Everybody says the same thing. This saves a minuscule $12 billion out of $1.9 trillion. But it angers a particular group of upper middle class people whose socioeconomic status matches that of the political journalists who will report on this. The last time we had that dynamic was 2015, when Democrats tried to kill and then quickly retreated on 529 savings plans for college education. This means nothing to the federal government and everything to people affected. Say I had a wife and 3 kids and made $150,000 a year. I would get $7,000 in payments. If I made just $10,000 more, I'd get nothing. Plus, those additional earnings would be taxed at the normal rate. If I lived in a high-tax state, the combined state-federal tax would be 30% on that money. In other words, I'd have nothing to show for making that additional $10,000. I'd take home the same as if I earned $150,000. This is called the high marginal tax rate, and it punishes people for no good reason other than the vanity of Joe Manchin and some colleagues. This is what legislating looks like, and it's what it will look like for the next 2 years, even if you get rid of the filibuster. Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, and every other Senate Democrat has maximum leverage if Republicans don't sign on to bills. And considering that Republicans are making Senate clerks spend 10 hours reading the entire American Rescue Plan, a process that's normally waived, I don't see much bipartisanship on the horizon. It's going to be a grinding, soul-crushing, enervating spectacle for those who want to see policy advances, even if the end result is positive. The American Rescue Plan is a powerful piece of legislation, but everyone will remember the useless extraction of 0.6% of its value in check targeting. Those are the biases of journalism and politics, and it's a fair point when popular policies are needlessly held back. And this is why we have to ask the question, whatever happened to the executive action blitz? When we conceived of the day one agenda, it wasn't just to play a parlor game about what a president can do without new laws from Congress. It was intended to respond to exactly the situation we're in right now. The paragraph below comes from my introduction to the series, written 18 months ago. It predicted a pretty obvious future. Democrats are only an even money shot at best to flip the Senate. And yes, even if they succeed, Mitch Grim Reaper McConnell, also known as Darth Vader McConnell, can obstruct the majority with a filibuster. And it would not be up to the next president, But the 50th senator ideologically, someone like Joe Manchin or Kirsten Sinema, to agree to change the Senate rules to eliminate the 60-vote threshold for legislation. There's always budget reconciliation, but that limited path goes through the same conservative Dems. I support pushing Manchin and Sinema and the rest of the caucus on the filibuster. I support whip counts and making McConnell's obstruction visible for all to see. Sinema appears pretty dug in, telling a constituent that the filibuster will, quote, result in better common sense legislation. So good luck with all that. But the day one agenda is a safety valve. It's not dependent on Sinema or Manchin or anyone in Congress. It reflects the progress that can be made using existing policy passed by Congress. Early on in Biden's presidency seemed to understand it. There was a flurry of executive action on a host of climate, economic, and national security policies. We've been tracking them all at our executive action tracker. There haven't been any changes in close to a month. Executive action was clearly seen as something you do to reverse a few policies of the predecessor and then move on to, quote, real, unquote, work. It's natural for policymakers and the media to make this shift, and the slow advancement of Biden's cabinet, because the Senate wasn't even fully organized till late January, accounts for some of this, as a lot of executive action happens at the agency level. There's also a pandemic on, and a lot of executive action is just managing the vaccination process. But it's a big bureaucracy and a lot that can be done. There are two reasons to focus on executive action. First, base motivation. The slow grind of the legislative process will wear down supporters, particularly once Biden runs out of reconciliation bills, while progress can still be made under existing law. Second, policy matters. The reason to do this stuff is because it would help people. It's worth reinterpreting the Trump tax cuts to make them more egalitarian and auditing the wealthy far more aggressively. It's worth descheduling marijuana and reversing the toll that the drug war has wrought on people's lives. It's worth bringing down the cost of prescription drugs through crackdowns on drug companies scheming and sustained use of eminent domain for patents. It's worth embarking on a hero's jubilee, quote unquote, to cancel student debt or automatically enroll debt-ridden essential workers in the public service loan forgiveness program. There are a ton of other ideas in banking policy and agricultural policy and defense policy and more. This has stalled out unacceptably, and that gets far too little attention. I read David Shor's Autopsy for Democrats, and there was a moment of recognition amid the robotic responses about ideological polarization that policy is a thing parties ought to practice when in power. Quote, how we should campaign and what we should do once in office are different questions. Our immigration system is a humanitarian crisis, and we should do something about that, unquote, Shore noted briefly. I'm concerned with what we should do. It'd be good to see more urgency from everyone else. And here Dave is referring to the executive actions that Biden can take. He can do a whole hell of a lot and make people love him and love the administration and love what is going on without having the huge deals in Congress. He can let the progressives and Manchin and Sinema fight it out in Congress while he improves people's situation drastically with his executive actions. What the hell is he doing? Not going through with those. It is absolutely nuts. It is absolutely crazy. It is political malpractice. More political malpractice from neoliberals who won't act, who won't do things, who are just a bunch of Herbert Hoovers. Next, there is the piece on David Shore by Eric Levitz. An interview with David Shore, by Eric Levitz. I am not going to go over most of this because I'm running behind and I have a lot to do, but I do want to share it with you. It is Okay, it is in the links that I've given you. What David Shore, who by the way happens to be a socialist, has been discussing is the way the polling is shaping up. What happened in the 2020 election? What really happened? And correcting the incorrect theories about the 2020 election and how it was different from the 2016 election, and what the appeal of Trump was, that in part it was based on ideological labels. And what emerges from his analysis of the polling, okay, is that what Democrats have to run on and what they have to speak about, what they have to present to the voters, is not ideological labels or ideological differences. The voters don't really care about that. And when they start sorting by ideology, then the Democrats, including the Democratic Socialists, they lose. It's got to be more like what Bernie does. Bernie always redirects attention to the policies that he favors and tries to get agreement on the policies. Okay, if you look at Ro Khanna, he refuses to admit to being a socialist when he's pushed that way and asked. He views himself, he says, as a capitalist. But how much difference is there between what Ro Khanna espouses policy-wise and what Bernie Sanders espouses policy-wise? If Ro Khanna were running for the presidency of the United States, do you think he would run on a different platform from Bernie Sanders' platform? I don't think so. I think it would be the same platform. He just wouldn't call himself a democratic socialist. It turns out that the polls that were being analyzed by David Shore were about how people were reacting to abstract questions, okay, of ideology, and also how they react to more concrete questions of policy issues that they agree or disagree with. The really basic thing here is that if we run on the policies, whatever we call ourselves, if we run on the policies, we can get people to agree with us. If we run in accordance with the polling, we can get people to agree with us. And if we push policies that they agree with us, or that they agree on, and that they support, we have a much, much better chance to increase progressive Congress people and representation of progressives in the Senate, okay, and in the House. And we can gain much more power in passing the things that we need. Shore points out that right now, the Senate is even more biased against the Democrats than the House. Now, it's very important that we pass H.R. 1 and H.R. 4. That it's very important right now that we pass D.C. statehood and Puerto Rican statehood, and pass redistricting reform in the form of H.R. 1, okay, in H.R. 4. He says, so we need to pass those reforms and we need Biden to remain popular. If his approval rating is below 50 by the end of the year, David Shore says, we're probably fucked. He says, I can't claim to know exactly what the electoral effects will be of doing these things, but all the polling I've seen suggests that things like H.R. 1 and adding states are above water. They're not as popular as a lot of economic issues, but they're above 50%. Of course, the economic issues are even more popular, okay, among people, even less susceptible to ideology. In other words, you got to avoid the culture war issues, not keep emphasizing the culture war issues if you want to win. But he says electoral backlash doesn't typically come from doing things that poll at 53 or 54%. It comes from doing things that poll at 30 or 40%. Like, by the way, what Manchin is trying to get Biden to do right now. I mean, I'm sure that the backing off of the eligibility criteria, if that were put to a poll, that would be polling at 30 to 40%. It wouldn't be polling above 50%. It wouldn't be popular. It would not be popular. Shore says, so I think the downside of things like H.R. 1, H.R. 4, and so on, I think, he says the downside of that stuff is low. He thinks the level of voter interest in procedural issues is low. If we lived in a world where voters punish politicians for playing procedural hardball, we would have a lot fewer Republicans in office. So, of course, that suggests that Democrats should be playing procedural hardball all they can. Biden is not doing this. He needs to do this. He needs to go beyond stimulus. He needs to go to H.R. 1 and H.R. 4 and the statehood bills while he's working on the economic bills, because the economic bills, of course, are above 60% and 70%, and they will be above 60%, okay, and 70%. But the Dems have to play hardball. If they don't play procedural hardball, they'll be gone after 2022. And the way the Republicans are securing the system to work for them, they might essentially be gone for good until it doesn't make any difference any longer if more progressive people come back into power. So, H.R. 1 itself, what about H.R. 1? So, Marsha Brown at the American Prospect views H.R. 1 as the path to democracy in America. After reviewing some history, and basically the takeover of the Supreme Court and the takeover of the electoral system by the Republicans and their further attempts to consolidate controls. And she reviews the impact of the CU decision of 2010, holding that the First Amendment prohibits limits on spending on political campaigns by corporations, nonprofits, and by labor unions. Then she gets to H.R. 1 and she says, the For the People Act, along with its sister bill, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is H.R. 4, of course, signals Democrats' commitment to voting rights and democracy reform. H.R. 1, which the House introduced for debate on Tuesday, includes provisions for automatic voter registration and empowers small donors through a public financing system. It would end partisan gerrymandering and overhaul federal ethics rules, including a code of ethics for Supreme Court justices. It passed. This says it will get a final vote in the House this week, but it now has passed the House and it's gone to the Senate. It is highly unlikely Republicans will support H.R. 1, given Mitch McConnell's antipathy to campaign finance reform. In other words, it will take legislative reform, Democrats eliminating the filibuster, to advance democracy reform. H.R. 1 takes a whole democracy approach, explains Stephen Spaulding, senior counsel at Common Cause. He cited 3 pillars in the legislation: expanding access to the ballot box. Pillar 2 is reducing the undue influence of money in politics, breaking the grip that big money has on the political system. And Pillar 3 is ensuring clean and ethical government. Advocates say the bill would make America a true democracy by rolling back the stranglehold big money donors have on the political system. Quote, it's the boldest pro-democracy reform package introduced in Congress since the Watergate era, unquote, wrote Sylvia Albert, director of voting and elections at Common Cause, for roll call. But the bill also points a path forward to how to react to conservative judicial rulings, a priority for democracy and voting rights advocates now that the Supreme Court has a 6-3 conservative split. There are a number of provisions in the bill that are responsive to the Supreme Court's decisions over the past 10 years, whereby they gradually deregulated the campaign finance system and really greenlit suppressive voting laws, unquote. Spaulding explained. H.R. 1 accomplishes this in a couple of different ways. It includes some statutory overrides, which overturn Supreme Court decisions based on congressional intent. For example, H.R. 1 would override the statutory decision in Husted versus Randolph Institute, which provided that Ohio's voter purges were allowed. Statutory overrides, as my colleague Rachel Cohn and I wrote about extensively last fall, are a key tool for Congress to take back its power as a co-equal branch of government. There's lots of examples where Congress responds to interpretation of the statute. That's the Lilly Ledbetter model, said Paul Smith, vice president of the Campaign Legal Center, referring to the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which overturned a Supreme Court decision. There's also the Civil Rights Restoration Act of 1987, which overturned a 1984 Supreme Court decision, Grove City College versus Bell, and restored the provisions of Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 to include private colleges and schools, not just schools that receive some federal funding. And President Reagan ultimately vetoed the bill. But the CU decision itself was a constitutional ruling. To address this, the For the People Act does something similar to a statutory override, only it attacks a constitutional decision not so easily overturned. The bill counters the influence of corporate spending by empowering small dollar donors as a countervailing force and by requiring greater transparency and interdependence of the big donors in political spending. An entire section of the bill is devoted to the CU decision. That ruling, the bill states, quote, erroneously invalidated even-handed rules about the spending of money in local, state, and federal elections, unquote. The bill continues, quote again, the Supreme Court's misinterpretation of the Constitution to empower moneyed interest at the expense of the American people in elections has seriously eroded over 100 years of congressional action to promote fairness and protect elections from the toxic interests of money, unquote. In this way, the legislation is somewhat unusual. if Congress passes the For the People Act, it would be curtailing or constraining the First Amendment rights the court provided for corporations. Typically, it's the court that is constraining constitutional rights, and Congress, the people's house, trying to expand them. The roles here are flipped. It's hard to imagine a constitutional right that Congress doesn't like, unquote. It's usually the other way around, unquote. The CU decision, among other decisions of the Roberts Court, helped create problems in the campaign finance space that now must be addressed through legislation. Experts explain that even the justices didn't quite realize what floodgates they were opening. In CU, the court erroneously assumed that existing independence requirements for political spending would extend to corporate spending. But in practice, corporations spent unlimited sums so long as they weren't formally coordinating, quote unquote, with a candidate. Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote the majority opinion, but in a speech at Harvard Law School, he appeared to back away from it, saying, quote, "What happens with money in politics is not good," unquote. Well, thanks, after making that huge mistake. Anyway, going on with this. Okay, I think the bill is a great bill. I also think it needs the exceptions clause in it. It needs to have the exceptions clause that prevents, it comes from Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution, and basically it would put forward the exception that the appeals courts of the United States are prohibited from ruling on this bill. Congress has the authority under Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution to put such a clause in. The clause is given in the Constitution. It's a phrase of a relatively few words. It's easy to include it in any campaign finance bill that Congress wants to include it in. It would set a precedent. It would not be a good precedent, but the Supreme Court has been setting terrible precedents, and it was created with its 6-3 majority in a very illegitimate way. And when you're talking about democracy as a social contract, the social contract has to be two-sided. With respect to the Supreme Court, it seems to me the Republicans have broken the social contract. And it's perfectly okay for the other parties to the social contract, ourselves, okay, the progressives, to suspend the social contract until the balance is redressed. And if that takes removing the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court from specific bills, such as campaign financing bills, then so be it. So be it. So, going beyond the stimulus, okay, again, this also relates to the For the People's Act. It's by Jake Johnson. It's today, March 4th. And many people coming out and saying, warning late Wednesday, that the For the People Act is destined to end up in the Senate's legislative graveyard unless the upper chambers, their majority, eliminates the undemocratic 60-vote filibuster. And then a number of people are quoted against the filibuster by Sean Eldridge, founder and president of Stand Up America, by Eli Zupnik. I think it's Eli. Was it Eli Zupnik? Is also quoted here. He's the head of the watchdog group Fix Our Senate. John Sarbanes talks about the importance, to deliver on the promise of H.R. 1 and restore faith in our democracy, and that we have no time to waste. Amy Klobuchar, who in 2017 was one of 31 Senate Democrats to sign a letter expressing support for the filibuster, the legislative filibuster. In an interview with Mother Jones, said she would approve of eliminating the filibuster to pass the For the People Act. We have a raw exercise of political power going on where people are making it harder to vote, said the Minnesota Democrat. Quote, and you just can't let that happen in a democracy because of some old rules in the Senate. The Washington Post's Greg Sargent noted in a column Wednesday night that, quote, what's critical here is that Klobuchar, who is decidedly not a member of the party's liberal wing, bluntly described the central question as when over whether Democrats would allow themselves to be steamrolled by a Republican exercise of power, unquote. The emphasis is on a Republican exercise, of power. And Mehdi Hassan tweeted, stop asking Cinnamon Mansion if they support the filibuster. Start asking them why they don't want to pass the For the People Act. And legislation on climate change and the rest of the vital bills that can pass via budget reconciliation and also can pass because of the filibuster. Chuck Schumer proclaimed Democrats are committed to advancing real solutions and fighting to uphold the core tenets of our Constitution in the face of Republican attacks, on voting rights. But Ezra Levin said, quote, let's not be coy. Mitch McConnell will filibuster these reforms to death unless pro-democracy senators stop him, unquote. Ezra Levin is co-executive director of Indivisible, which, as you know from last night, has a campaign going on to get rid of the filibuster. Quote, we know this because we've been here before. In 2019, McConnell called the democracy-saving reforms, quote, socialism, unquote, and quote, power grab, unquote. And he refused to even allow the vote on the legislation, unquote. And Jayapal said that, quote, we cannot allow for archaic Senate procedures to derail progress and undermine our democracy. It's past time to abolish the filibuster so we can deliver real results for the American people, starting with the For the People Act, unquote. And by the way, if you're interested in forcing the vote on Medicare for all, you'd better get rid of the filibuster too. Because if you don't have the filibuster out of there, we're not getting Medicare for all. Because it won't be done through any reconciliation bill. So next, there is such a thing as bad stimulus. Bad stimulus. Not bad because the stimulus is in itself bad, but bad because government payments to individuals are a terrible way to solve America's structural problems. So this appeared on Naked Capitalism, but it was actually produced at Economy for All, a project of the Independent Media Institute, and it was written by Albina Asmanova and Marshall Auerbach, who's a researcher at the Levy Economics Institute and who is a long-time MMT economist. Okay. Marshall has, on occasion, been a co-author of mine as well. So, the new Democratic administration is poised to make its first proud step in delivering on its electoral promise to build back America better, and there's a reference there to the stimulus package. And then the point is immediately made, Biden's stimulus is not the stuff of economic revolution. It's a mix of common sense and keeping the lights on. And it certainly is. The reality is that social programs on healthcare and education and a new era of labor and banking regulation would put the wider society on sounder feet than a check for $1,400. And not to mention, by the way, a federal job guarantee. Missing from the frame of thinking that dominates the stimulus debate, there is something essential. The commons, a robust public sector of goods, e.g. energy and services, e.g. healthcare, that makes societies resilient to crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic and weather-incurred power shortages. Ironically, it is this very deficiency, achieved through decades of cuts to public spending and privatization of public assets, that transformed the COVID-19 epidemic into a public healthcare disaster, and likewise turned Texas into the equivalent of a broken down banana republic during the worst of its power grid shutdowns brought about by decades of adherence to market fundamentalism, read neoliberalism, in regard to public infrastructure goals. These have been occurring since the backdrop of economic lockdowns that were implemented to prevent the spread of a pandemic and an even greater public health disaster. A veritable Sophie's choice was imposed because of insufficient hospital capacity and a chronic deficiency of basic protective gear for medical personnel and medical equipment to care for the gravely ill. In other words, more market fundamentalism that eviscerated a robust public health infrastructure, increasing a number of hospital beds is a worthy objective, but in many instances this will simply restore cuts to previous programs that were attacked by a private health insurance pharmaceutical industry complex that prioritized profits and returns on equity over public health considerations. It is no replacement for the bold social experimentation that would truly address the flaw in capitalist democracies that have dominated the 21st century. If the Biden administration is serious in its ambition to build back better, it must adopt a broader, proactive policy approach on these issues, rather than keeping American society on life support through a trickle of stimulus packages that tackle the symptoms as opposed to the underlying disease. So, the point is plainly made. You need more than stimulus. You need structural change too. And you need a change in ideology away from neoliberalism as well. You need legislation for the public purpose. Legislation accompanied by social experimentation. You need things like the federal job guarantee. And you need things like Medicare for all. You need the kinds of things that Biden is hesitant to do, not just hesitant, explicitly against when it comes to Medicare for all. He's going to have to change. He's going to have to change, or we are all done. So we got to go beyond the stimulus to deeper structural changes. And the final piece we come to, final piece is, where is it? It's from Common Dreams. It's by Yanis Varoufakis. Biden must go beyond fiscal stimulus. This is an opinion piece by Yanis. It appeared a few days back, actually, on March 2nd. Okay. U.S. President Joe Biden, facing the great challenge of stimulating his country's economy for the post-pandemic era, and haunted by then President Barack Obama's tepid stimulus in the face of the Great Recession a decade ago. He should have said Obama's flaccid stimulus, has decided to err on the side of overshooting. He wants to go big with a 1.9 trillion spending plan. He put quotes around the go big, by the way. Prominent centrists like Larry Summers and Olivier Blanchard warned that Biden's decision may prove his undoing. Their argument is that too much stimulus will trigger an inflationary surge, resulting in an interest rate spike that will force his administration to slam on the austerity brakes just before the midterm elections in 2022, costing his Democratic Party control of Congress, just as too little stimulus cost Obama control of Congress in the 2010 the midterms of 2010. So Larry Summers, of course, was calling for austerity now to avoid austerity later, because surely austerity now would give Biden. Larry Summers is full of crap. The problem with this debate is that both supporters and critics of Biden's stimulus plan assume there is a dollar amount that is big enough but not too big. Where they disagree is on what the figure is. In fact, no such figure exists. Every possible stimulus size is simultaneously too little and too big. To see why, there can be no Goldilocks, quote-unquote, stimulus that gets the amount, quote, just right, unquote. It helps to engage the critics who argue that the administration's proposal would overheat the economy and hand the Republicans the midterms. Central to their prediction is their tacit assumption that there is also a Goldilocks interest rate and a corresponding stimulus size that will deliver it. What would render any rate of interest, quote, just right, unquote? First, it would achieve the right balance between available savings and productive investment. Second, it would not unleash a cascade of corporate bankruptcies, bad loans, and a fresh banking crisis. And there's the rub. It is not at all clear that there is a single interest rate that can do both. Once upon a time, there was. In the 1950s and early 1960s, under the Bretton Woods system, an interest rate of around 4% did the trick of balancing savings and investment while keeping bank profitability at a level that allowed credit to reproduce itself sustainably. Back then, if the investment fell below available savings for too long and failed to recover despite a reduction in the interest rate, a well-designed government stimulus raising investment back to the level of savings, the rate of interest picked up and the balance was restored. Alas, we no longer live in that kind of world. The reason capitalism no longer works like that is the manner in which the Obama administration, aided and abetted by the Federal Reserve, refloated the sinking Western banks. The 2008 crisis was as deep and terrible as that of 1929. As in 1929, sequential bankruptcies, unemployment, and falling prices meant no one was willing to borrow. Interest rates nosedived to zero, and capitalism fell into what John Maynard Keynes referred to as the liquidity trap, quote unquote. Once at zero, the interest rate could not go much lower without destroying what was left of the banking sector, insurance companies, pension funds, and other financial institutions. The great difference between 1929 and 2008 was that in 2008, the banks were not allowed to fail. One way to save them was a large enough fiscal stimulus. Direct injections of freshly minted money to consumers and firms to pay off debts and to increase consumption and investment would have refloated Main Street and indirectly Wall Street. This was the road not taken by the Obama administration. Instead, the Fed printed trillions of dollars and the failing banks were refloated directly. But while the banks were saved, the economy was not freed from the liquidity trap. I don't think that was a liquidity trap. I think it was a depression, a financial depression in the real economy. The banks were saved from that, but not the real economy. The banks lent the new money to corporations, but because their customers were not refloated, managers were unwilling to risk plowing the money into good jobs, buildings, or machines. Instead, they took it to the stock market, causing the largest ever disconnect between share prices and the real economy, the asset inflation we talked about from time to time. Following Wall Street's near-death experience in 2008, corporations became hooked on almost interest-free credit and rising stock valuations that flew in the face of low profits. Total savings dwarfed investment, aggregate wages were at an all-time low, and consumer spending remained subdued. And then suddenly COVID-19 arrived, with the ensuing lockdowns dealing major blows on both the supply and demand side of the economy. The 12 years before the pandemic arrived explain why a sizable stimulus today may not achieve what it could have achieved in 2009. The successful stimulus must bring investment closer to the level of available savings. But the moment financial markets get a whiff that this is about to happen, they will push interest rates up to a level reflecting the better balance between savings and investments. So immediately, corporations hooked on low interest rates will face ruin. So will their bankers. I beg to differ a bit with this because financial markets do not determine interest rates. The Fed and Treasury in collaboration do. They determine the overnight federal funds rate. And Giannis should know this very well. Very, very well. I think he does. I don't entirely get his argument here. But I do find this post in general very, very good. I'll tell you in a little while why. In theory, this can be prevented if the stimulus simultaneously boosts incomes and consumption so that corporations' rising income can compensate for the rising interest rates. No, don't allow the interest rates to rise. The markets are no match for the Fed and the Treasury collaborating to set interest rates. But in practice, there is no time for corporations to be weaned off their dependency on low interest rates. They don't have to be weaned off because the Fed will supply the low interest rates. Because any stimulus takes a lot longer to stimulate incomes than it does to boost interest rates. Sorry, I scrolled too far. Oh, let me get that back. The combination of the liquidity trap and 12 years of corporate dependency on near zero interest rates has therefore seen to it that any fiscal stimulus now, whatever its size, is bound to fail on one of or both of its crucial aims: to boost investment and to prevent a chain reaction of corporate failures. Going big might have worked in 2009, but in 2021, Biden must go beyond stimulus. Whatever quantity of money he puts into the U.S. economy, he will fail unless he does what is necessary to lift the spending power of those who have next to none. A decent minimum wage, compulsory collective bargaining, and direct unconditional payments. Okay. In other words, structural changes in the economy that do not exist now. We need not only one so-called stimulus check or relief check or survival check. We need multiple unconditional payments to have the consumption power there. We need compulsory collective bargaining to have the consumption power there. And we need a decent minimum wage to have the consumption power there. And it's debatable at this point whether $15 an hour is going to be enough. But it is a start. And in any case, Biden must go beyond stimulus to structural changes, as both Yanis Varoufakis, and the team of Asmanova and Auerbach have shown us. We have to go beyond fiscal stimulus to other more structural changes in the economy if we're going to get anything done. Some of this may come in the second reconciliation bill, because Biden intends to be much more structural within that particular bill. But there's no substitute for getting back in the decent minimum wage, except perhaps a de facto decent minimum wage as supplied by a federal job guarantee program, which hopefully will be coming in the second reconciliation bill that Bernie is starting to work on right now. Okay, that's my say for tonight. I now turn, in the famous words of Eli Wallach, I now turn to use. And Bonnie says, use? Oops. Sorry about that. Okay. Back to your comments. So I answered the Votogramma one. Terry Burke says, I like the fireworks graphics. It represents what we hopefully will happen on the Senate floor. Yeah. Lana says, hi all. Well, the Votorama is probably going to have some fireworks. You probably should see the Votorama, but you'll probably be bored to death at all the voting down. You won't know what they're voting down, what they're voting up. Steve Gonzo says, Jimmy Dore's at it again. Force the squad. Force the vote. He should still use force the vote, not change the hashtag. Force the vote. The minimum wage vote. The vote on including the minimum wage back in. Kay says shared. Dia says greetings. Oops, I scrolled down way too fast. Finally got a night off. Great to see you again. How about that useless Ron Johnson wanting the entire bill read out loud? More obstruction, in my opinion. In everybody's opinion, Kay says sounds like a cluster FU quote CK to me. Not sure what that quote was in the middle. Lana says, Ron Johnson, what a mess. Terry Burke says, Schmuck Schumer. Schmuck Schumer? Little Chucky Schmucky. Sandy Degg says, helloing. And Dia Swift said, such about of touch useless tool except for the nationalists and QAnon. He's useful for them. Terry says 10-hour reading. Dia says, I love your sense of humor when outrage is getting his grip on me over these charlatan politicians. Manchin's daughter is a big farmer higher up. No wonder he's against progress. Not only that, she's known for overcharging people for drugs, for unconscionably jacking up the price of drugs. Manchin took some heat over that at the time. He did. Manchin is getting high from his newfound power. Shake my head. Kay says, Evelina Pont, we're here. Sandy Degg says, share. Thank you, Sandy. Dia Swift says, just when McConnell got subdued here, we have just as bad in Manchin. But Manchin we can bring under control. Evelina says, was silent till now. Hi, Kay, laugh out loud. Kay says, hi, Evelina. Terry says, 24. But Manchin can do a lot of harm before then. He can do a lot of harm before 2022. 24, it might be futile. In 24, resistance could be futile because of the damage he does between now and 2022. He's got to be stopped now. Terry Burke says, and she's a bought and paid for advisor. Terry Burke says, bought. Even as, can I ask what the parliamentarians' objection to raising the minimum wage was? She said that the minimum wages affect the budgetary impact. Okay, the minimum wage was incidental in her view. It was just an accident. Now, in the reconciliation bill that she ruled on, which the Republicans put through when they were making the tax cuts, there were some things in that bill that were justified because of their very large impact on the budget. And she ruled them in. She ruled them in for reconciliation. Nor is Elizabeth McDonough, nor is she a Republican. She was appointed by Harry Reid. She's most probably a Democrat. Obviously, though, a neoliberal. Terry Burke says even Clyburn is complaining. And Anthony grinned. Terry Burke said, caveman hasn't even neutralized but de joy. He's supposed to be moving on that front. Specifically, he has nominated people now for the Board of Governors, and he's making sure they are people who will be in favor of getting rid of de joy. And supposedly that is now really beginning to move. And Evelina says, Biden doesn't strike me as a leader. He acts like he's taking orders. Doesn't seem all there either. Strikes. I don't think Biden's taking orders. I think he's doing what he wants to do. Sandy says Biden is taking orders. Biden isn't running anything. Well, maybe. I am wary of this new administration, I have to say. Well, me too. I'm wary, but I don't even give Biden the excuse that he's taking orders. I think he has his priorities. Those are neoliberal priorities. Kay says Arizona needs a higher wage. Damned expensive to live there. Yep, I imagine it is. Sandy says it's expensive to live anywhere at this point. It certainly is, Sandy. And Catherine Tokarska, hi Catherine, says, I'm sure they can put up some bogeyman and Munchkin will still get reelected. Only 63%. California residents fleeing from prices here. Where are they fleeing to? Are they fleeing to Arizona? Maybe Nevada? Also, are all California residents fleeing? I have a cousin who has retired. I'm not sure she's fully retired, but substantially retired, who lives in Palm Desert, California, as opposed to Palm Springs. She loves it out there, and evidently costs are not yet too high for her. And Harudo says, who is Harudo? Anyway, Lanadell says, if I don't laugh a little, I will just cry, laugh out loud. Terry Burke says, The Art of War. Catherine Delkoska says, friend has some rentals in Yuma. Almost everyone who tried to get one recently was from California, and there was a line. Yeah, probably. Terry Burke says, awesome column by Sirota. Oh, yeah, Sirota's a great writer, great columnist. His wife is in the state legislature in Colorado. And one day, I'm just waiting for Dave to run for Congress himself. In any case, though, he was, of course, a staffer for Bernie Sanders. Now, on multiple occasions, at least twice. Terry says, will they find the balls to finally play a hard ball like that, though, Dr. F? I don't know. There's often a problem, okay, with idealists. And the new progressives in the House are all idealists. They really are. Cory Bush, Ocasio-Cortez, Tlaib, Omar. I don't know if they're going to find the balls to finally play hardball. Because remember, they would again have to play hardball with Nancy Pelosi, because you can be sure that once the revised bill comes back from the Senate and the House has to vote on it, even if the minimum wage is in there, Nancy Pelosi is going to want to fold, and she's going to tell them, as soon as this bill goes through, we'll immediately resubmit the minimum wage as a standalone bill. She'll tell them, we'll keep fighting. And it's going to be necessary for the progressives to say at that point, it's not enough to submit a bill and say you're fighting. This is the fight. It is now. What fighting means is we don't pass this bill if our measure is not in it. No ifs, ands, or buts. The minimum wage is an essential measure, and they need to tell Pelosi it's a basic value of ours, and you have told us it's a basic value of yours, and you have told us often enough that basic values cannot be compromised. This time, you, Nancy, have to live up to it, and we're going to make you live up to it, because this bill doesn't get out of the House until the minimum wage is back in it. Send us to the conference committee, and we will put the minimum wage back in it. Kay says, I believe it. I can remember when California was a truly progressive state, pre-Reagan, that is. Catherine Tokarska says, I'm in Southern California and #van life. I have to say that I'm struggling a lot lately, and today was the first day I thought to myself that I'm super tired and want a room in a stick house. But I'll get over it. Kay says, sorry, honey. And Terry says, because you already know how much progressives love their, quote, mama bear, unquote. Catherine says, wasn't so bad when the gym was fully open and restaurants, libraries, where you could sit for a while. Hopefully it will pass. It may pass because the gym may well be fully open again. Those vaccines are coming out fast now. If you don't have the vaccines already, you'll be able to get them soon. Then the gyms will be able to open, and the restaurants, and also the libraries. We may have to wait until this summer for that to happen, but this is March already. It's March, April, May, could happen by June, almost certainly. It'll be possible for them to open again in July, the way the vaccines are going. Kay says, but many of us are close to that all over this country, including me. I can't even afford a car to live in. Catherine says, I need to find a caravan. Have to tell you, part of the struggle is that vans are selling like hotcakes. So are the things you need to put in them. Backlog on solar installs, on insulation, etc. It's crazy. Met several people on the road who lost jobs and threw the COVID money into building a van. Terry says, Catherine Tokarska with gypsies, tramps, and thieves. Oh no, that's Capitol Hill. Kay says, Catherine Tokarska, there's an FB group here I'm involved in called Occupy Homeless. You might want to check it out. Can't always get a Dodge Caravan. They're cheap but serve vanners well, especially starting out. There's a group called Home on Wheels Alliance. They are helping poor people get into minivans. Kay says, I haven't even had a DL in many years. Catherine says, Terry Burke, unfortunately, yes, there is substance abuse and mental illness in the vehicle habitation community. Catherine says, Terry Burke, thanks for the invite. I get distracted and miss the talks. Catherine Tokarska, how can I ever overlook that pretty puppy on your page? My pleasure. Catherine Tokarska says, I highly recommend watching Nomadland film that just came out. Director won the Golden Globe. Also first Asian female director to get the honor. Somber, but also heartwarming movie. Catherine Tokarska gives a link. I'll probably end up watching that, Catherine. Catherine says, Bernie is good about that. Terry says, lost all the comments. Terry says, lost the live stream. Sandy says, try leaving and coming back. Evelina says, I can't scroll back enough to see more than 4 or 5 comments. Kay says, Facebook doesn't like us tonight. Terry said, had to start the entire device. Fascist book. Terry says, fascist book doesn't like the progressives at any time. Kay says, I just lost my whole internet. SMH. Hate spectrum. Evelina says, Terry Burke, Facebook is going to get nasty sooner than later. Evelina says, not the best service, or has been years, especially since 16 Bernie consciousness. Terry says, it. Kay says, horrible, Evelina Pond. Wish we had another choice here, but we don't. Evelina says, Terry Burke's going to get noticeably worse soon. And Evelina says, this is the problem with monopolies. It is. They don't have to give you good service. That's right. Kay says, exactly what I was going to say, Evelina. Evelina says, totally for a new social contract. Kay says, yes, me too. Terry says, corporation considering setting up shops in Nevada get sole sovereignty to make people abide with whatever they want and say. Kay says, I heard that, Terry. Kay says, the DNC crammed Biden down our throats. Well, Obama crammed Biden down our throats in the end. Obama and Clyburn together got Biden crammed down our throats. They were aided and abetted, of course, by Buttigieg, Klobuchar, and the wild crane, Beto O'Rourke. I read again today how young people are choosing not to have babies, and that will be a huge issue. They're not getting medical job security, and housing is unaffordable, so they're saying no dice on the young uns. I don't blame them one bit. Terry says, like they did for unsinkable turd HRC. Well, she turned out to be sinkable, didn't she, Terry? Kay says, exactly, Terry, that is why we got rump. Evelyn says, they realize how ridiculous they sound talking austerity? Apparently not. Evelyn, well, people, like Ari Summers, they're old. They're old. I shouldn't make fun of him. He's younger than I am, I believe. But they're old people, and they're old people. Terry says, and the Republicans will resurge in the midterms. Hell, even Booker, the big farmer hooker, is tag teaming with Romney big time. Yeah, Cory Hooker's at it again. Kay says, I'm about ready to stop voting. What good has it done me? None. Never give up, Kay. We need your vote. Terry says, well, if you didn't vote for Trump, it saved your ass from fascism. Kay says, holding my nose to vote for HRC and Biden were anti-romp votes. Neither of my children are having babies, said Sandy. They can't afford them. Sandy said, use guys. Sandy says, it's a Jersey thing. Yeah, it is a Jersey thing. It's a Brooklyn thing, too, to say use, I mean, use comes from Brooklyn originally, I think. I don't think it comes from Jersey originally. But maybe it does come from Jersey originally. Yeah, but when I was a kid, it was the Dodger fans who said use. They always said use. The Brooklyn Dodger fans. That's how far back I go, Kay says. I wouldn't want to bring any kids into the mess we have now anyway, Sandy. Terry says, Eli was cool, use. Is that like my cousin Vinny, the two youths? Exactly, Lana. That's exactly what it is. Sandy says, exactly, Case. Terry Burke says, incidentally, my shiny Heine, Bernie, and many other progressives ran $15 an hour on their platforms plastered all over their campaign pages and threads. I know. Terry Burke says, Ajibola Soliu. Hello, my beloved. I have a grace message for you now. Please inbox me reading. Kate Clark Ryan. Hello, my beloved. I have a grace message for you now. Please inbox me reading. Steve Gonzo said, crash. Looks like we got some kind of troll here. And Biden is a complete disappointment, all BS until he is elected. He could be speaking openly for the minimum wage hike and everything else, and we see how that is going. Yeah, Biden's a liar. Looks like the Turtle's wife, Connie Chow, or something like that, is in hot order for abusing money power. Yeah, for using her position to make money for her family, right, in China. Ajibola Soliu, I don't need blessings for am your God. Kay says, I reported that, Terry. Terry says, gyms will be open, but COVID is still mutating. I know, but we may be able to beat the rate of the mutation by getting enough vaccines into enough arms quickly before it has a chance to mutate beyond the effects of the vaccines. Twitter's banned Panquake. Obama sucks and Clyden too, along with the DNC and the rest. Terry Burke says there are old fools and old wise folks. And Kay says, yes, all of us are not stupid, Terry, nor crazy either, nor crabby, nor anxious to put people down. Is her name Elaine Chao? I am not good with names. Yes. I think it's spelled Chao, but yes, it is Elaine Chao. Right. That is it. What, did we call her something else? Oh, yeah. Terry Burke called her Connie Chow because there used to be a Connie Chow who was a commentator for either NBC or CBS, right? Yeah, I remember her. And Terry Burke said, well, we knew caveman was going to be a total Neanderthal. No. Actually, if he was going to be a Neanderthal, he would have been a lot tougher than he is. I think he's just a caveman, that's all. Connie Chung, yes. Connie Chung, that's right, Steve Gonzo. Terry says, oops, sorry about the Connie thing. Yeah. Elaine Chow, that's who it is. Okay, guys, we're at 11. And I've caught up to your comments. So I think I'm going to say good night. I will see you on Saturday night. Looks like things are happening quick. The Votorama will be happening between now and then. And we're going to have to get beyond the stimulus thing, as we discussed here tonight. Kay says, thank you all for another great discussion. Love you all. We love you, Kay. And Dolores says, thank you and good night. Thank you, Dolores. Lana says, is Joe Biden supposed to be the Neanderthal? I missed that. Well, he's the caveman. So Lana says, good night. And Dolores says, thank you and good night. Sandy says, thank you, Joe, Bonnie, and everyone. Thank you, Sandy. And Terry says, time for snooze fest. Good night. Thanks, everyone, and good night.